What would you do if the son you sacrificed your whole life to raise suddenly disappeared behind walls of wealth? For Mabel, an elderly mother from a remote countryside, the 6-month silence from her successful son was more terrifying than any storm. She decided to travel hundreds of miles to Boston, to her son's lavish mansion, only to be confronted with a chilling truth the moment the door creaked open. This is not just a story of a mother's love, but a journey to uncover a dark conspiracy hidden beneath a perfect facade. If you are listening from anywhere in the world, leave a comment and subscribe, because some truths need to be spread, even if they might shake your beliefs. Some stories, no matter how painful, must be told. The dawn was just beginning to tint the fields with light when Mabel woke up, as she had done her entire life. Her small home in rural West Virginia, with furniture worn by time, was submerged in the same silence as always, a silence that in recent years had become heavier. The morning chill seeped through the walls, but that didn't matter to her. Mabel had something more urgent that troubled her: her son. Mabel had grown accustomed to long, sleepless nights, thinking about her son. 6 months had passed since his last brief, cheerful phone call. The letters she sent went unanswered, and the last one, a birthday card filled with a mother's love, had just been returned to her, stamped "Return to Sender." That was the final, chilling sign. Although she had tried to justify his silence with the relentless pace of life in Boston, the returned card was a rejection she could not ignore. The neighbors' questions, "And your son, Mrs. Mabel?" now felt like salt in a wound. As she dressed in her best clothes, a simple tweed skirt and a worn cotton blouse, Mabel made a decision. The silence had become a physical weight. If Julian wouldn't come to her, she would go to him. She had raised her son with her own hands, working from sunrise to sunset, in the fields after her husband's death. He was everything to her. She couldn't leave him without at least knowing the truth. Was he okay? Had he found something that was keeping him from his mother, or was there something darker behind his disappearance? With a small suitcase in hand, Mabel left her house, closing the door with a lump in her throat. The journey to the city was a formidable one, a long haul on a Greyhound bus that would carry her hundreds of miles from everything she knew. The emotional weight of it made the hours seem to stretch into days. She sat in a corner, watching the familiar Appalachian landscapes recede through the window, the green hills and winding roads of her life giving way to the flat, sprawling highways of the coast. She remembered the last time she had said goodbye to Julian as he left for the city, his face bright with dreams and promises. He promised to call, promised that his success would also be hers. But now, with the silence of the past 6 months weighing on her, those once hopeful memories filled her with an overwhelming sadness. As the hours passed, the landscape changed. The vast hills of the countryside transformed into gray, tall buildings that seemed to defy the sky. The city was noisy, bustling, and to Mabel, completely foreign. The car lights, the incessant noise of traffic, the rush of people, it all made her feel small, as if she were in a place where she didn't belong. But there was no turning back. Julian was here, and she had to find him. Upon arriving at the bus station, Mabel felt overwhelmed by the number of people coming and going without even noticing her. With difficulty, she found the crumpled paper with Julian's estate address. She had kept it in her purse since the last time he wrote to her. The address was in one of the most exclusive areas of the city, a place she never imagined visiting. She took a taxi, and as the car drove her through the luxurious streets, Mabel gazed in amazement at the enormous buildings and mansions that passed by her window. She had never seen houses so large, so perfect. They were cold, immaculate, and seemed lifeless. She remembered Julian's promise. "One day, I'll bring you to live with me, Mom. To the city, where everything is easier, more comfortable." But Mabel never wanted to leave her life in the mountains. The only thing she ever wanted was for her son to be happy, even if it meant being far from her. Finally, the taxi stopped in front of an imposing estate. The wrought iron gates and the perfectly manicured garden intimidated her. With trembling hands, she paid the taxi driver and got out of the car, standing in front of the door. She felt the weight of the luxury that surrounded her, as if the place itself was judging her. She took a deep breath and gathered her courage, ringing the doorbell. Several minutes passed, which for Mabel seemed like an eternity. Finally, the door opened slowly, revealing a young, elegantly dressed woman. Her beauty was cold, and her eyes, upon meeting Mabel's, filled with a mixture of surprise and contempt. "Yes?" the woman asked, not even trying to hide her disdain. "I'm Mabel, Julian's mother," she replied with a trembling voice. The woman's face showed no emotion, not a smile, not a welcoming gesture. "Julian is not home," she said curtly. "He's very busy with his company." Mabel's disappointment and unease intensified, but she didn't let herself be intimidated. She had come from far away, had traveled with a broken heart to see her son, and she wouldn't leave so easily. "I've come from the countryside to see him. I can wait until he returns," she said with a calmness that didn't reflect the emotional chaos she felt. Isabella, as the woman introduced herself, looked at her with a mixture of irritation and disdain. After a few seconds of discomfort, she finally agreed to let her in, leading her to a small room next to the entrance. The contrast between the opulence of the mansion and Mabel's humility was evident, but she didn't let it affect her. She just wanted to know where her son was and why he hadn't told her anything about his new life, especially about his marriage. The wait would be long, but at that moment, Mabel was willing to do anything to be reunited with Julian. The silence in the house, however, was unsettling, and as Mabel settled into a sofa that looked like it had never been used, a dark feeling began to grow in her chest. Something was not right. She could feel it. Mabel couldn't stop looking around as she settled into the enormous and luxurious living room of the estate. The contrast between the old furniture of her country house and the coldness of the opulence that surrounded her at that moment was overwhelming. The walls were adorned with expensive paintings, and the velvet curtains fell heavily to the floor, as if hiding secrets behind them. However, despite the luxury, something in that place seemed empty to her, as if the house itself lacked life. Mabel shifted uncomfortably on the leather sofa, which creaked under her weight. She couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong there, but her love for Julian kept her steadfast. She had traveled so far to see him, and she wouldn't leave without answers. She looked around for signs of her Sona photo, some memento that would confirm this was his home, but she found nothing. Not a single photograph of Julian, not a trace of his presence. It was as if the mansion reflected nothing of him. A few minutes passed before Isabella, Julian's wife, returned to the room. Her expression remained cold, almost detached, and she carried a cup of tea, which she placed in front of Mabel on a low coffee table. "Here to warm you up," she said with an indifferent tone. "Thank you, my dear," Mabel replied softly, hoping to break the barrier between them. "When do you think Julian will be back? I'm looking forward to seeing him." Isabella sat in a nearby chair, crossing her legs with a calculated elegance. Her eyes scanned Mabel's small, tired body, as if evaluating every aspect of her humble appearance. "Julian is very busy lately," Isabella replied. "His company consumes all his time. Sometimes he doesn't even come home at night. He's always traveling, closing important deals. He's a very sought-after man." Mabel nodded slowly, but something in her words didn't convince her. This wasn't the Julian she knew. Her son had always been dedicated, yes, but also affectionate. He would never have left his mother for so long without communicating, much less with the indifference that Isabella now projected. Every word she said seemed to have a layer of coldness and distance, as if there was something she didn't want to reveal. "And when do you think I can see him?" Mabel insisted, her voice firmer than before. "I don't know," Isabella replied, standing up again. "It could be days, maybe weeks. I'm not sure of his schedule, but if you wish, you can stay here until he returns." Isabella didn't wait for an answer before turning to leave, leaving Mabel alone once more in that huge, empty living room. Mabel watched her figure disappear behind a door and was left with the echoing sound of her own thoughts. Time passed slowly in the mansion. The rays of light that entered through the windows began to fade as the sun set, dyeing everything in orange and golden tones. The seconds felt eternal as Mabel waited for some sign, some news of her son. The tea Isabella had brought her had grown cold, but she didn't touch it. Her stomach was too unsettled to drink or eat anything. Hours later, Mabel began to feel even more uncomfortable. The silence in the mansion was unsettling, almost oppressive. The walls seemed to close in, and every small sound, from the creaking of wood to the distant murmur of the staff, was amplified in her mind. She knew something was wrong. Her mother's instinct screamed at her that there was something hidden behind that coldness, something Isabella was not willing to tell her. The house staff passed by from time to time, avoiding looking at her directly. They were like shadows, moving quickly from one room to another, as if they wanted to remain invisible. This only increased the unease in Mabel's heart. No one gave her a smile, not even a look of understanding. She felt like a stranger in her own son's life. Finally, when darkness completely enveloped the house, Isabella returned to the living room. This time, she offered no explanation or kind word. She simply stopped at the entrance, looking at Mabel. "It's late, Mrs. Mabel," she said without emotion. "I will ask Arthur, our butler, to take you to a room so you can rest. Julian may be several days late in returning." Mabel stood up, nodding slowly. Although her heart was full of uncertainty, she wanted to say something, to ask more, but she knew Isabella would give her no answers. Her son's wife had an impenetrable barrier around her, and there was no way to get through it for now. The butler, Arthur, appeared at the door. He was an older man, with a face marked by experience and a cautious expression. He motioned for Mabel to follow him through the dark corridors of the mansion in silence. As they walked, Mabel noticed that Arthur avoided making eye contact with her, but there was something in his attitude that made her think he knew more than he let on. They arrived at a small room, far from the center of the house. It was nothing more than a guest room, but for Mabel, it was more than enough. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. She sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the echo of Arthur's footsteps fading down the hallway. The silence fell upon her again, a silence that weighed on her chest. Before Arthur closed the door, Mabel stopped him with a question that had been on her mind since she arrived. "Excuse me, Arthur, right?" she said softly. "Do you know when my son will be back?" Arthur hesitated, as if unsure whether he should answer. Finally, he nodded slightly without looking at her. "Your son, Julian, is complicated, Mrs. Mabel. He is busy," he said, and without adding more, he closed the door behind him. Arthur's words resonated in Mabel's mind. There was something in the way he spoke that left her uneasy. The same empty words that Isabella had repeated, but this time with a tone that hinted at something more. What were they hiding? Lying on the small bed, Mabel tried to close her eyes, but she couldn't sleep. Her son was somewhere, perhaps closer than she thought, but wrapped in a mystery she couldn't comprehend. What was Isabella hiding from her, and why did no one seem to want to talk about him directly? As her thoughts wandered, Mabel knew one thing for sure. She would not leave that mansion until she discovered the truth about her son. Something was wrong. She felt it in the depths of her heart. The first ray of sun entered through the heavy curtains of the room when Mabel opened her eyes after a night full of restless dreams. The emotional exhaustion weighed on her body, but she knew she couldn't stop. Although Isabella insisted that Julian was traveling, her heart told her otherwise. There was something in that mansion that didn't fit, something that everyone around her seemed to be hiding. She got up slowly, feeling the cold of the floor under her bare feet, and dressed in the same clothes she had brought from the countryside. Once ready, she decided to go down to the dining room, hoping that perhaps Isabella would finally give her more concrete news about her son. As she walked through the long corridors, the absolute silence enveloped her. She could barely hear the footsteps of the house staff moving like shadows between the rooms without giving her a single word or a glance. When she reached the dining room, she found the large table empty. No sign of Isabella, nor any other family member. Only a couple of servants passed from one side to the other, serving a breakfast that seemed more appropriate for a feast than for the solitude in which the house was found. She sat down slowly in one of the chairs, uncomfortable with the luxury that surrounded her, but decided to wait. Minutes, perhaps hours, passed, but Isabella did not appear. The mansion, despite its size, seemed empty, and the feeling of abandonment grew in Mabel's chest. The servants moved in a hurry, avoiding her, without even offering a simple gesture of courtesy. It was as if they were afraid she would ask them a question, as if Mabel's presence broke the controlled and cold routine that Isabella had imposed. After finishing breakfast without even remembering what she had eaten, Mabel decided to walk through the mansion. Something pushed her to discover what was happening, to find any clue that would reveal where Julian was. She passed by several locked rooms, which she found strange in such a large house. Every time she tried to approach one of the doors, a servant would appear, as if they were watching her, giving her an excuse to move away from that area. In one of the farthest corridors of the house, near the area that seemed reserved for the service staff, Mabel saw Arthur, the butler. He was bent over, cleaning an old table, but when he noticed her presence, he stopped. His eyes, laden with a mixture of concern and caution, watched her for a second too long. "Arthur," Mabel called, approaching slowly. The man looked up, and although he seemed uncomfortable, he did not avoid her like the others. "Mrs. Mabel," he replied in a grave voice. "Where is my son?" she asked directly, feeling that she could no longer pretend that everything was fine. Arthur tensed, as if that question had put him in a dangerous situation. He looked to the sides, making sure no one else was listening. "Ma'am," he began, but then fell silent for a moment, as if struggling with the words. "It is not my place to say." Mabel realized that Arthur knew something important, but for some reason he couldn't say it at that moment. However, her intuition told her that he was the key to discovering what was really happening in that house. "If it's not your place, then whose is it?" Mabel replied, trying to remain calm. "My son is all I have, and something tells me you are not telling me the whole truth." Arthur looked away, clearly affected by the situation. But before he could say anything more, a sound in the hallway alerted him. Isabella appeared in the doorway, her cold presence filling the atmosphere. "Is everything all right here?" she asked with a tense smile, looking at Mabel and then at Arthur, who immediately moved away, continuing with his work without saying another word. Mabel felt the weight of Isabella's gaze on her, but she said nothing. She knew that for the moment she had to be cautious. Pressing her lips together, she gave a small nod of her head and returned to the main living room. Later, as the afternoon fell, Mabel decided to approach Arthur again, knowing that her only ally, though silent, was trapped in the fear that Isabella inspired in all the employees. She found him in the kitchen, organizing some cutlery, and this time she made sure no one else was around. "Arthur, I know you know something. I beg you, tell me the truth," Mabel pleaded in a low voice, her eyes full of supplication. The butler looked down, but this time he couldn't avoid answering. "Mrs. Mabel, things in this house are not what they seem," he whispered in a tense tone. "Your son Julian is not on a trip, he is here, in the house." Mabel felt a blow to her chest. Julian was in the house all this time? Why had Isabella lied? Before she could ask more, Arthur continued, lowering his voice even more. "Julian had an accident months ago, a very serious accident. Since then, Isabella doesn't let anyone see him. She keeps him hidden. I can't say more, ma'am, but you have the right to know. Just be careful. Isabella is not who she seems to be." Mabel's heart beat forcefully as she tried to process what she had just heard. Julian was in that mansion, perhaps nearby, and she didn't even know it. What kind of accident had he suffered, and why was Isabella keeping him hidden? Before she could ask more questions, Arthur quickly moved away, leaving Mabel alone in the kitchen with the weight of her new suspicions. That night, in her room, Mabel couldn't stop thinking about what she had discovered. Something terrible was happening in that house, and now she knew it for sure. Isabella had lied to her from the beginning. Her son, her dear Julian, was there, somewhere, and they were keeping him prisoner in some way. The intrigue and fear consumed her, but one thing was clear. She would not leave that mansion until she knew exactly what had happened to her son and why his own wife was keeping him away from the world. Mabel promised herself that she would discover the truth, no matter the cost. That night, Mabel could barely sleep a wink. The murmurs of the shadows seemed to resonate through the corridors of the mansion, mixing with her own thoughts. She knew Julian was there, so close and yet so far, but he was being hidden, kept in the shadows by Isabella's coldness. Arthur's words haunted her. Julian is in the house. But why did no one talk about him? What kind of accident had he suffered to be kept locked up, invisible to the world? Anxiety and fear wouldn't let her stay still. The silence in the mansion was even more oppressive than usual, and the feeling that something was wrong devoured her from within. She got out of bed, determined to act. She knew Isabella would tell her nothing more, and the few clues she had gotten from Arthur were not enough. She had to find the truth for herself, even if it meant risking the unknown. Barefoot and with cautious steps, she left her room and walked through the corridors of the mansion, which were barely illuminated by the dim lights of the lamps. Her breathing quickened with each step, and the echo of her feet seemed to resonate in every corner, as if the whole place was watching her. The elongated shadows of the furniture seemed to move around her, and Mabel felt a shiver run down her spine. She passed by several closed doors, remembering how in previous days she had noticed that many of the rooms were completely locked. She stopped in front of one of those doors. It was a large wooden door with a heavy lock. Something inside her told her that behind that door was hidden a part of the truth she was so desperately seeking. She tried to turn the knob, but it was locked, like so many others. Just as she was about to walk away, she heard a sound of faint, almost imperceptible murmur. It came from the other side of the door. Mabel held her breath and pressed her ear against the wood. She couldn't make out words, but what she heard was unmistakable. Someone was talking, and it wasn't a monologue. It seemed like a conversation. Fear mixed with curiosity. Who was there? Could it be Julian? Mabel took a step back, her heart pounding. She couldn't open the door, but this confirmed her suspicions. Something was happening behind those locked doors. Before she could move, a figure appeared at the end of the hallway. It was Arthur, the butler. Seeing her there, he tensed visibly. He walked towards her, his steps silent, as if trying not to alert anyone else in the house. "Mrs. Mabel," he whispered, "you can't be here. Isabella must not find out." Mabel looked at him, her eyes reflecting the urgency of a mother desperate to know the truth. "Arthur, please tell me the truth," she said in a low, almost pleading tone. "My son is here, isn't he? You can't keep hiding what's happening from me. Something is wrong. I feel it in my heart." Arthur looked nervously down the corridor before meeting her gaze. His expression was a mixture of pity and terror. "He is here, Mrs. Mabel?" he whispered, his voice strained. "But he is unwell since the accident." "What accident?" Mabel pressed, her voice breaking. Arthur flinched. "A fall. That is the official story." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "He's confined, in the West Wing. Only she and the nurse are allowed in." Arthur's voice cracked with emotion he could no longer contain. "He was a good man, Mrs. Mabel. A kind master. He treated the staff with respect. Not like she does. We have all watched him fade away, helpless. I cannot stand by and see it through to the end." He glanced over his shoulder, then met her eyes with a new, firm resolve. "Her office, and her brother's. They are always locked," Arthur added, his voice barely a whisper. "Every night, she leaves the key ring on the hook in the main pantry while the staff prepares her evening tea. It's the only time." He didn't say more, but the implication was clear. He was giving her a window of opportunity, not a key. The risk would be Mabel's alone. Mabel felt a whirlwind of emotions: pain, anger, fear. Julian, her son, was being held prisoner in his own house, under the control of his wife, and no one was doing anything to help him. "I have to see him," Mabel said, clenching her fists. "I have to see my son." Arthur looked at her sadly. "It's not that easy. Isabella has eyes everywhere. She doesn't allow anyone to get near Julian without her permission. But there is someone who might be able to help you." Mabel looked up, hopeful. "The nurse who takes care of Julian is named Clara. She is the only one who has seen him since he got sick. If you can talk to her, maybe you can find out more." Mabel nodded, feeling a spark of hope light up her soul. Now she had a name, a possible ally, but she also knew that any false move could put not only her son's health at risk, but also her own life. Arthur took her arm gently and guided her towards the back of the house, where there was a small garden hidden by the high walls of the mansion. "You can't go directly," he warned. "You must wait for the right moment. Isabella leaves the house at certain times to attend to business. When she's away, I'll find a way for you to talk to Clara. But please, Mrs. Mabel, be careful. We are not safe here." Mabel nodded with determination. The fresh air of the night garden hit her face, giving her a moment of clarity. She knew the pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but she also understood that confronting Isabella would be a challenge full of danger. Back in her room, Mabel dropped onto the bed, her mind in constant turmoil. Julian was there, somewhere in the mansion, and she would not stop until she freed him. But now she knew she was not alone in this fight. Clara and Arthur were the key to discovering the truth and getting her son out of the clutches of that house, which, despite its luxurious exterior, hid dark secrets within. The night grew even longer, but this time Mabel did not feel the same emptiness. She knew what she had to do, and nothing and no one could stop her. The sun was beginning to rise on the horizon when Mabel woke up, her thoughts still clouded by what she had discovered the night before. She knew that the situation in the mansion was much darker than Isabella had let on, and that her son was trapped in the middle of a plot she did not yet fully understand. But Isabella's cold and calculating face and Arthur's fearful tone made it clear to her that nothing that happened there was an accident. She was waiting for the right moment, just as Arthur had promised. Isabella had left the mansion early to attend to some business matters. Mabel felt that this was the moment she had been waiting for. Her heart pounded as she walked through the corridors towards the area where Arthur had told her she would find Clara, the young nurse who cared for Julian. Finally, she reached a discreet door, almost hidden at the end of a long corridor. She took a deep breath before knocking gently on the door, her hand trembling with accumulated tension. After a few seconds that felt like an eternity, the door opened, revealing a young woman with a tired but kind face. It was Clara. "You are Julian's mother?" Clara asked in a whisper, as if she already knew who she was, although she had never seen her before. Mabel nodded, her throat closing with contained emotion. "I need to know the truth about my son," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Please, tell me what is happening. What has happened to him?" Clara looked nervously around, making sure no one was listening. Then, with a quick gesture, she motioned for Mabel to enter. Once inside, Clara closed the door carefully and turned to her, her eyes reflecting concern. "Mrs. Mabel, there are many things I shouldn't tell you, but you have the right to know," Clara began in an almost inaudible tone. "Your son is gravely ill, and not just because of the accident Isabella mentions. I can't prove it, but I suspect that Julian has been slowly poisoned." Mabel's world stopped in that instant. Clara's words fell like a dry blow on her chest. "Poisoned?" Mabel whispered, unable to comprehend. "How is that possible? Who could do such a thing?" Clara took a deep breath before continuing. "Isabella. She controls everything that happens in this house, and since Julian's accident, no one else has had direct access to his care. Except for me and a few people she trusts. The symptoms your son presents are not consistent with a fall. The weakness, the vomiting, the loss of mobility. Everything points to him having been consuming something that has weakened him slowly. I have no concrete proof, but every time he shows signs of improvement, he suddenly worsens after one of Isabella's visits." Mabel felt a cold rage take hold of her. How could Isabella do something so monstrous? Her son, her dear Julian, was being destroyed from within by the person he had trusted most. "It can't be," she said, struggling to hold back tears. "Why would she do that? What would she gain by harming him?" Clara looked at her with sadness. "Control. Since Julian fell ill, Isabella has taken control of all the businesses. She has made suspicious financial moves, and her brother, Caleb, is also involved. Everything points to them slowly emptying Julian's accounts, appropriating his assets. If Julian dies, Isabella would inherit everything." Clara's words sank deep into Mabel. Everything began to make sense. Isabella's coldness, the silence in the house, the evasive glances of the staff. It was a plot, a meticulously calculated plan to take from Julian not only his life, but everything he had built with so much effort. And meanwhile, her son lay in a bed, slowly wasting away. "We have to do something. We have to get him out of here," Mabel said, her voice laden with desperation. Clara nodded. "I know, but it won't be easy. Isabella has everything under control. Every medication Julian receives passes through her hands first, and she has the doctors under her command. I've tried to change the treatment, but every time I try something different, Isabella finds out. I don't know how much longer I can continue to help him without her noticing." Mabel felt a lump in her throat. The fear for her son's life was greater than ever, but she knew they couldn't stand by idly. They had to come up with a plan, and do it quickly. But they needed proof, something they could take to the authorities to expose what Isabella was doing. Without proof, everything would be in vain. "Is there any way to get proof of what they're doing to him?" Mabel asked, her gaze fixed on Clara. The young nurse nodded, though cautiously. "I have been collecting samples of the medications Isabella gives Julian, and I think I can get a trusted doctor to analyze them. But I will need time, and it will be risky. If Isabella discovers what we are doing, she could make things worse for Julian." Mabel knew that time was not on her side, but she also understood that without proof, she would have no chance. Isabella and Caleb were dangerous, and any mistake could endanger not only Julian's life, but also Clara's and her own. "You have to do it, Clara. It's our only option," Mabel said, taking the young woman's hands with a desperate urgency. "Please, we have to save my son." Clara nodded with determination in her eyes. "I will do it, but you also have to be careful. Isabella is not stupid. If she suspects we are plotting something, she would not hesitate to act. What we are doing here is extremely dangerous." Mabel knew it. The danger loomed over her like a constant shadow, but the love she felt for her son was stronger than any fear. No matter what she had to do, no matter the risk, she would not rest until she saw Julian out of danger. As Clara began to collect the samples and prepare her plan to analyze them, Mabel was left alone in the small room. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of emotions. On one hand, she felt fear of what Isabella was capable of doing. But on the other hand, a growing fury and determination kept her on her feet. She knew that the fight ahead would not be easy, but she was prepared to face it. As she left the room, Arthur appeared in the hallway. His eyes, though tired, showed some relief. "Have you found out?" he asked in a low voice. Mabel nodded. "Julian is being poisoned. Isabella is killing him slowly." Arthur closed his eyes for a moment, as if what he had just heard confirmed all his suspicions. Then he looked at Mabel with determination. "I will help you in any way I can. We can't let Isabella get away with this." Mabel nodded. She knew that now more than ever she would need allies, and Arthur and Clara would be her pillars in this fight. Time was running against her, but now she had a plan, and above all, hope. As the sun began to set, dyeing the skies a deep red, Mabel felt that the battle for her son's life had just begun, and she was ready to face Isabella, no matter what that meant. The days passed slowly in the mansion, each one laden with a silent tension. Mabel felt the weight of uncertainty crushing her more and more as she awaited the moment Clara could obtain the proof of Julian's poisoning. She couldn't afford to make a single mistake or act rashly. The threat posed by Isabella and Caleb was greater than she had imagined. During the day, Mabel spent most of her time walking the corridors of the house, observing the movements of the staff and Isabella with attention. However, her son's wife seemed busier than ever, constantly talking on the phone and leaving the house to attend to business matters. Although she maintained a facade of control and elegance, Mabel perceived the coldness and contempt every time Isabella crossed a room without deigning to look at her. Meanwhile, Arthur continued to be her only ally among the mansion's staff. The butler kept her informed about Isabella and Caleb's movements, while Clara did the impossible to keep Julian stable and collect the samples of the altered medications. Mabel knew that the evidence would not be enough to save her son. They also needed to unearth Isabella's past, something that could completely unmask her. One afternoon, while the gray sky threatened rain, Mabel decided to investigate on her own. She knew that somewhere in that mansion there must be more clues about who Isabella really was and what dark plans she was hiding. Arthur had warned her about Isabella and Caleb's offices, which were in one of the most remote rooms of the house. They were 2 rooms that were always locked, but the butler, in an act of loyalty and desperation, had provided her with a copy of the keys. With her heart beating rapidly, Mabel approached the door of Isabella's office. The mansion was unusually quiet, and she knew that Isabella and Caleb had gone out to attend an important meeting in the city. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The key turned in the lock with a faint click, and Mabel gently pushed the door open. The office was a perfect reflection of Isabella's personality, impeccably cold and without a hint of human warmth. Mabel's hands trembled as she searched the desk. There was no secret file conveniently labeled. Instead, tucked into a locked drawer she managed to pry open with a letter opener, she found not a confession, but pieces of a puzzle. There were recent, heavily one-sided life insurance policies on Julian. Beside them were pharmacy receipts for drugs she didn't recognize, prescribed by a doctor she'd never heard of. Most damning of all was a thin folder containing newspaper clippings from years past, detailing the accidental deaths of 2 other wealthy, older men Isabella's previous husbands. There were no direct links, but the pattern was chilling and undeniable. Julian, her son, wasn't the first. He was the 3rd act in a repeating tragedy. One of the oldest letters, written by the brother of one of the deceased, recounted how he had tried to investigate his brother's death, but all his attempts had been thwarted. Isabella had made sure to silence the media and anyone who tried to question the official version of the accident. Mabel felt a sense of disgust and horror wash over her as she realized that Isabella had been repeating this cycle, marrying rich men, manipulating them, and getting rid of them to keep their fortunes. Julian, her dear son, was the next victim in that long list of betrayals and deaths. Mabel clenched her fists as rage and pain fought to overwhelm her, but she knew she couldn't give in to those emotions. She had to stay strong, focused. This information was crucial, but it might not be enough to convict Isabella without the proof of the poisoning. However, with this file, she could at least expose her true character to the authorities. She quickly put the file in her purse and left the office. There was still Caleb's office, and Mabel was convinced that there she would find more evidence of the financial conspiracy both siblings had been carrying out while Julian lay helpless in his bed. With the same caution, she went to Caleb's office, whose door she also opened with the key Arthur had provided. The interior was much more austere than Isabella's, with piles of papers and legal books stacked everywhere. Unlike Isabella's meticulous order, Caleb seemed to have a controlled chaos around him. Mabel began to review the folders and documents on the desk, looking for anything that could incriminate Caleb and his sister. What she found sent a chill down her spine. Contracts signed by Julian, where he ceded control of his businesses to Isabella. The signatures were recent, but Mabel knew that Julian had been too ill to even hold a pen in recent weeks. That could only mean one thing: the signatures had been forged. In addition, she found several records of money transfers to unknown accounts, all linked to Isabella and Caleb. The money Julian had worked so hard to earn was disappearing, being drained in a carefully calculated plan to impoverish him and leave Isabella as the sole heiress of what was left. The proof was there, right in front of her. Isabella and Caleb had been manipulating Julian's businesses since he fell ill. They didn't just want his life, they also wanted to destroy his legacy, his effort, everything he had built. Mabel took some quick photographs of the documents with her phone, knowing she had to move fast before someone discovered her. She put the evidence in her purse and left the office, her heart pounding. She had everything she needed: Isabella's dark past, the forged contracts, and the financial records that proved the betrayal. The only thing missing was the proof of the poisoning. She returned to her room, feeling that she had finally taken a crucial step towards saving her son. But the weight of what she had discovered also crushed her. How could someone be so cruel? How could the woman who had promised to love and care for Julian be behind such a monstrosity? The next day, Mabel met with Clara in secret. The nurse gave her the samples of the medications she had collected over the last few days. She stored them carefully, knowing that a trusted doctor would analyze them. If their suspicions were confirmed and the medications were adulterated, they would have the definitive proof to take to the authorities. "How long do you think it will take to get the results?" Mabel asked anxiously. Clara sighed, clearly exhausted by the tension of the last few days. "I hope in a couple of days, but we must be careful. Isabella is starting to suspect. If she notices we're up to something, she might act before we have the evidence." Mabel nodded, feeling that time was her greatest enemy. Every day that passed, Julian's life hung by a thread, but she also knew they couldn't rush. The only way to defeat Isabella was to be meticulous, just as she had been in her plan to destroy Julian. Clara promised she would continue to keep Julian as stable as possible, although it was getting harder. The situation became more desperate as the days passed, but both women knew they couldn't give up. Mabel returned to her room that night, overwhelmed by the weight of the evidence she had collected and by the fear that Isabella would discover what they were plotting. She knew a confrontation was inevitable, and that when that moment came, she would need all the courage and strength she had left to face a woman as dangerous and calculating as Isabella. She looked out the window, where the city lights flickered in the distance. She wondered how many other lives Isabella had destroyed with her unbridled ambition. But one thing was clear to Mabel: her son would not be the next victim. With this renewed determination, Mabel mentally prepared herself for the next steps. The days passed slowly in the mansion, and with each passing hour, it felt as if time was against her. Mabel knew the situation was becoming more critical with each day Julian remained under Isabella and Caleb's control. However, she now had an advantage. The evidence was on its way, and her son's poisoning was about to be exposed. But there was something else that worried her deeply. Even if they got the proof, Julian was still a prisoner in his own home. Isabella had barely left the mansion in recent days, which complicated any attempt to get close to Julian. Her movements were cold and calculated, and Mabel couldn't help but feel that Isabella was beginning to suspect something. However, fate soon gave her the opportunity she was waiting for. One morning, Arthur informed her that Isabella and Caleb had an important meeting out of the city and would be gone for most of the day. This was the moment Mabel, Clara, and Arthur had been waiting for. The escape plan had to be executed now, while Isabella and Caleb were away. Any delay could be fatal. They knew they couldn't just take Julian out of the mansion without someone stopping them, so they had devised a meticulous plan. It was barely dawn when Isabella and Caleb left the house. The butler, always efficient and discreet, confirmed that the guards at the entrance and the security cameras had been temporarily deactivated thanks to a small malfunction he himself had orchestrated. Time was on their side, but they also knew that any mistake could cost them dearly. Clara was in Julian's room, preparing him for the move. Julian, though weak and barely conscious, seemed to sense that something important was about to happen. His eyes, dimmed by illness, moved slowly as he tried to understand what was happening around him. Mabel entered the room silently and stopped upon seeing her son in that state. She had spent weeks unable to get close to him, and now that she had him in front of her, she couldn't hold back her tears. The man who had been her pride, her strong and determined son, now lay in bed like a shadow of what he once was. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his body had thinned so much that he seemed fragile, vulnerable. Seeing him like this broke her heart into 1,000 pieces, but it also ignited a strength in her she didn't know she had. She couldn't let Julian die in that place. "Julian, my son," she whispered as she approached the bed, gently stroking his hand. I'm here to get you out of this." Julian slowly turned his head towards her, and although he couldn't utter a single word, Mabel saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. She knew that deep down, her son was still fighting, even though his body was weakened by months of poisoning. Clara approached delicately. "We have to move him now, before Isabella gets back," she said in a whisper. "I've prepared the ambulance. It will take us to a private clinic where he'll be safe." Mabel nodded, quickly wiping away her tears. She knew this was not the time to fall apart. Together, Clara and Mabel helped Julian sit up as gently as possible. Julian's body could barely support itself, and every small movement seemed to cause him pain. But there was no alternative. They needed to get him out of there before it was too late. Arthur appeared at the door with a wheelchair, and very carefully they placed Julian in it. The silence in the mansion was absolute, but every little noise, from the squeak of the wheels to the rustle of the sheets, seemed to resonate loudly in the empty hallways. Any sound could alert someone, and they couldn't afford to be discovered. The journey through the mansion's corridors was tense, with every shadow and every corner feeling like an imminent threat. As they moved towards the back exit where the ambulance was already waiting, Mabel couldn't help but imagine what would happen if Isabella or Caleb returned early. Her heart pounded, and the sense of urgency grew with every step they took. Finally, they reached the back door. The ambulance was there, just as Clara had promised, with a driver she had hired, someone trustworthy who would ensure they reached the clinic without problems. With great care, they placed Julian on a stretcher and lifted him into the vehicle. Mabel didn't allow herself to relax until the ambulance doors closed and they began to move away from the mansion. Clara was by her side, closely monitoring Julian's condition as the vehicle sped towards the clinic. Although they knew the immediate danger had passed, the risk was still enormous. Isabella and Caleb would soon discover that Julian was not in the house, and when they did, they would react with fury. As the ambulance drove away, Mabel looked out the window, watching the mansion grow smaller in the distance. A part of her felt relief at seeing the place that had caused her son so much harm disappear behind them. But another part, the more rational one, knew that the real battle was about to begin. Getting Julian out of the mansion was just the first step. The private clinic they arrived at was small, discreet, and away from the hustle and bustle of the city. Clara had carefully chosen the place so that Julian could receive medical attention without Isabella or Caleb being able to interfere. As soon as they arrived, a medical team, aware of the situation, took charge of Julian, immediately taking him to a room where they began to treat him. Mabel remained in the waiting room, sitting on an uncomfortable plastic chair while Clara and the doctors worked inside. She knew they were doing everything possible to save him, but the wait was unbearable. Every minute that passed without knowing how her son was doing tore her apart. After what seemed like hours, Clara came out of the room with an expression of moderate relief. "Julian is stable for now," she said in a reassuring tone. "The doctors believe we can reverse some of the damage he has suffered, but it will be a long and complicated process. The important thing is that he is in a safe place." Mabel let out a breath she had been holding all day. Although her son was still fighting for his life, the fact that he was out of Isabella and Caleb's control was an immense relief. She knew Julian was not completely out of danger, but at least he had a chance to recover. "What do we do now?" Mabel asked, looking at Clara with eyes full of uncertainty. "Now we must wait for the results of the medication tests," Clara replied. "If we confirm that Julian was poisoned, we can bring the case before the authorities. The evidence you have about the financial movements will also be crucial. Isabella and Caleb will not be able to get away with this." Mabel nodded, although she knew that moment was still far off. There was still much to do, and Isabella's threat was still latent. They wouldn't stand idly by when they discovered Julian had escaped. But for now, Mabel allowed herself a moment of peace. Her son was safe, even if only temporarily, and that was more than she had had in weeks. With a tired but determined face, she sat in the waiting room, knowing that the fight was not over, but that at least they had taken an important step towards Julian's freedom. The silence in the clinic was different from that of the mansion. Here, there were no lurking shadows or dark secrets. Here, there was hope. The sun was just beginning to set behind the hills when Isabella and Caleb arrived at the mansion. The atmosphere in the vehicle was tense. They had had an important meeting, but their minds were not entirely on business. Isabella had noticed small changes in the house in recent days. There was something in the air that unsettled her, and although she couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was, she felt that things were not under her control as they used to be. When they reached the main entrance, something immediately caught her attention. Security seemed relaxed. Isabella frowned and got out of the car, walking quickly towards the door. Caleb, who had always been more methodical and cautious, followed her with firm steps. The mansion seemed quiet, but that absolute silence that had once seemed comforting to her now felt unsettling. Upon entering, they were greeted by the butler, Arthur, as always, with his neutral countenance, but Isabella noticed something different in his gaze. It was almost imperceptible, but she knew how to read people, and Arthur seemed uncomfortable. Isabella watched him for a second, too long but said nothing. Inside, her distrust was growing rapidly. "Is everything in order, Arthur?" she asked, her voice soft but laden with authority. "Everything is as usual, madam," the butler replied, avoiding eye contact, which only served to increase Isabella's suspicions. However, she decided not to press him for the moment. Over the years, she had learned to trust her instincts, and that instinct told her that something had changed while she was away. She looked at Caleb, who, although he did not share the same sense of urgency, nodded briefly as if he understood what she was thinking. Without a word, they both began to walk towards the wing where Julian had been confined. Meanwhile, at the clinic, Mabel was anxiously watching the clock. Clara had insisted that she needed to rest after the day's tension, but the mother could not get the image of Isabella and Caleb discovering Julian's escape out of her mind. She knew that moment was about to arrive. Soon, the silence in the mansion would be replaced by a storm of fury. The doctor came out of Julian's room, where they had been stabilizing him for the last few hours. He approached Mabel and Clara, who were waiting in the hallway. "Your son is stable for now," the doctor reported. "His body has responded well to the initial treatment, but he has been subjected to a slow and prolonged poisoning process. It will take him time to recover completely, if he does." Mabel swallowed hard, her heart tight with anguish. "Is he going to survive?" she asked with a trembling voice. The doctor paused, as if carefully choosing his words. "He has a good chance of surviving, but he will need constant attention. The damage caused by the poisoning is extensive, and his recovery will be a long and difficult process. What he needs most now is rest and stability." Mabel nodded, relieved that at least her son was still alive. But she knew that this relief was temporary. Out in the real world, the threat of Isabella and Caleb remained, and it was only a matter of time before they started looking for Julian. "The proof of the poisoning," Clara began to say, interrupting her thoughts. "How much longer will it take to get the results?" "A few more days," replied the doctor. "What we have found so far confirms our suspicions, but we need a more detailed analysis to present it as formal evidence." A few days. Mabel felt that those days would be an eternity. There was no time to lose. Every second that passed was an opportunity for Isabella to act, and Mabel knew they would not stand idly by. At the mansion, Isabella and Caleb reached Julian's room. Isabella opened the door with the same cold confidence as always, expecting to find her husband in the helpless and vulnerable state she had left him. But when she entered, her heart stopped. The bed was empty. For a second, she couldn't process what she was seeing. There was no medical staff, no equipment, no trace of Julian. The room was completely empty. The silence that had prevailed in the house now became deafening. Her cold gaze transformed into an expression of pure bewilderment. She turned slowly towards Caleb, whose eyes had widened as he understood what Julian's absence meant. "Where is he?" Isabella spat, her tone barely controlled. Caleb began to quickly check the room, as if hoping to find some clue that would tell them where Julian had gone. But everything was meticulously in order, with no signs of a struggle or any kind of problem. "This can't be happening," Isabella murmured, beginning to lose the control she worked so hard to maintain. "How is it possible that he's gone? No one could have taken him out of here without me knowing." She approached Arthur, who had followed at a safe distance. "Arthur, who was here while we were away?" Isabella asked, her tone icy. Arthur, who had been waiting for this moment, kept his gaze low. "Only the usual staff, madam. No one from outside the house. No one saw him leave." Isabella began to lose her calm, her facade of control and power crumbling rapidly. "How is it possible that he disappeared without a trace?" Arthur paused slightly, as if carefully choosing his words. "It's possible that someone from the staff helped him leave." He left the sentence hanging in the air, knowing that pointing a finger at someone directly would put more than one person at risk, including himself. Isabella turned to Caleb with an expression of pure hatred. "I knew we should have taken more precautions." I knew we couldn't trust anyone, she said, almost spitting the words. But it doesn't matter. We will find him, and when we do, there will be no one left to stand in our way. Back at the clinic, the atmosphere was tense. Mabel, though relieved by her son's safety, couldn't stop thinking about the storm that was about to break. She knew that Isabella and Caleb would stop at nothing to regain control of Julian and his businesses. Clara, noticing her concern, sat next to her. I know what you're thinking, she said in a low voice. Isabella is going to come for him. We know that. But now we are closer to getting what we need to stop her. Mabel nodded, but she couldn't calm her heart. Julian has suffered so much, she murmured. I don't know how we got to this point. How did I not see who Isabella really was? Clara placed a hand on Mabel's, trying to convey comfort. You did everything you could, she said. And now you've done the most important thing. You got Julian out of that place. Now is the time to fight to make sure he never falls into their hands again. Mabel knew Clara was right. Isabella and Caleb might be powerful, but now they had weapons too. The proof of the poisoning, the documents that showed the financial and legal maneuvers. There were still many unanswered questions, but what was clear was that Julian was no longer a passive victim. They would fight for him, and this time Isabella and Caleb would face justice. As night fell and the fresh clinic air came in through the windows, Mabel mentally prepared for what was to come. It wouldn't be easy, but a mother's love is an unstoppable force. Isabella may have carefully planned her conspiracy, but she underestimated the power of love, sacrifice, and determination. The battle for Julian's life and legacy had just begun. The day began, like a calm before the storm. Mabel, sitting by Julian's bed in the clinic, watched her son breathe softly. The regular sound of the heart monitor was the only constant sign that life was still fighting within his weakened body. Beside her, Clara carefully checked Julian's vital signs, making sure everything was in order. The doctors had managed to stabilize him, but they knew that recovery would be slow and that the damage caused by the poisoning had left deep scars. However, the mere fact that Julian was safe and beginning to improve was a small victory, a ray of hope in the midst of darkness. But Mabel knew that the peace she felt at that moment was only temporary. She knew that Isabella would not give up easily, and that at any moment, her unleashed fury would fall upon them. The clock ticked slowly, each tick-tock on the wall, a reminder that the final confrontation was approaching. Only one thing was missing to set their plan in motion: the definitive proof that confirmed Julian had been poisoned. Suddenly, Clara rushed into the room with an urgent expression on her face. The tests have arrived, she announced, unable to hide the nervousness in her voice. The results confirm what we suspected. Julian has been receiving progressive doses of poison in his treatment for months. Mabel felt a mixture of relief and horror. Relief because they now had the evidence they needed to bring Isabella to justice, and horror because that evidence confirmed the evil of the woman who had betrayed her son. Isabella had not only tried to destroy him physically and emotionally, but she had done so with methodical cruelty, poisoning him slowly to take away everything he had built. And now what? Mabel asked, trying to stay calm as her mind raced with possibilities. Clara, always pragmatic, quickly replied, with the medical evidence, along with the financial documents we already have, we can file a formal complaint, but we must act fast. Isabella will not take long to find the clinic, or worse, use her influence to try to stop us before we reach the authorities. Mabel nodded, aware of the gravity of the moment. She knew they couldn't afford any mistakes. With the evidence in hand, the next step would be to confront Isabella and Caleb in their own game, but this time with the law on their side. Meanwhile, at the mansion, Isabella was beside herself. The employees, terrified of her temper, moved quickly to avoid getting caught in her path. The news of Julian's disappearance had unhinged her, not only because her control over him had vanished, but because she feared what might happen if someone discovered what she had really been doing. If Julian managed to recover, if the evidence of the poisoning came to light, her entire life, her fortune, and her reputation would be in danger. This can't be happening, she muttered as she paced frantically in Caleb's office. We had everything under control. Caleb, calmer but equally worried, sat behind his desk, reviewing the contracts and financial movements they had manipulated for months. It's not as simple as him disappearing, Caleb said without looking up. If Julian is receiving medical treatment, it's only a matter of time before they recover the evidence of the poisoning, and then we'll be lost. Isabella looked at him with fury, clearly frustrated by his calmness. Then we have to stop him, she shouted, her eyes burning with rage. We can't let it get to that point. Not now. And how do you suggest we do that? Caleb asked, his tone cold. We can't go to the clinic and just take him out of there. It's too late for that. Isabella knew her brother was right, but that didn't mitigate her desperation. She knew that Mabel and Clara were behind all of this, and the idea that her perfect plan was crumbling before her eyes filled her with anger. There are other ways to control the situation, Caleb said, finally looking up. If we can get the authorities on our side before they present the evidence, we could discredit them. We need to make this all look like a personal attack by Mabel to regain control of Julian's businesses. Isabella smiled, understanding her brother's plan. Yes, we can make it seem like this is all a trap. Discredit Mabel, make her look desperate. After all, who would trust a desperate mother trying to blame her daughter-in-law for an accident? They both knew that although it wasn't a long-term strategy, it could buy them enough time to prevent the evidence from reaching the authorities and somehow change the narrative. Later, at the clinic, Mabel and Clara were preparing to take the evidence directly to the authorities. They knew they couldn't wait any longer. Clara had contacted a trusted lawyer who knew the case and would accompany them to present the medical evidence and financial documents. Everything was ready. Just as they were about to leave, Clara's phone rang. The lawyer's voice on the other end of the line was tense. There's a problem, he said. Isabella and Caleb have filed a complaint against you. They are alleging that Julian was kidnapped by his mother and that this is all part of a plan to regain control of the businesses. Mabel felt the ground crumble beneath her feet. How is that possible? She asked, her voice broken with indignation. Julian is fighting for his life. I know, the lawyer said. But it seems they are pulling strings behind the scenes. They are trying to discredit you before you can present the evidence. You need to act now. Mabel turned to Clara, knowing that the legal battle they were about to face would be even more difficult than they had imagined. But she also knew they couldn't stop. Julian's well-being and life were at stake, and she couldn't let Isabella win this time. Let's go, she said with renewed firmness. Let's fight with everything we have. Mabel did not face them in a dramatic courtroom showdown. Instead, she sat in a sterile police conference room, her hands shaking as she and Clara laid out the evidence for two stern-faced detectives, the pharmacist's receipts, the insurance policies, the lab results from the adulterated medicine Clara had smuggled out. The detectives listened, their expressions unreadable. The battle was not won with a gavel, but with the quiet, methodical work of an investigation that followed. Weeks later, Isabella and Caleb were arrested, not in a grand spectacle, but in a swift, silent apprehension at their mansion. The news came to Mabel via a phone call from her lawyer. There was no triumph, only a profound, weary relief. The sentence fell on them like a death blow. Isabella, who had manipulated everything around her for years, watched her empire crumble in a matter of minutes. Security officers escorted her out of the courtroom, while Mabel, relieved but exhausted, collapsed into a chair, feeling that justice had finally triumphed. The days following the trial were a mixture of relief and reflection for Mabel. After Isabella and Caleb's sentencing, life began to return to a calmer pace. Although the healing process for both Julian and herself would be long, the warm summer wind blew gently over the countryside where Mabel had lived most of her life, and where she now found herself again, next to her son, who was slowly recovering in the tranquility of the family home. Julian had been transferred from the clinic to a small rented country house near Mabel's home, where he received constant medical care but was far from the painful memories of the mansion. Although his health was still fragile, he had shown clear signs of improvement in recent weeks. His strength was returning little by little, and although the road ahead was still long, he was alive, out of danger, and surrounded by his mother's love. Mabel was sitting on the porch of the small house, looking at the horizon as the sun slowly set. The sky was tinged with warm colors, and the sound of birds filled the air. So much had happened in recent months that at times it was hard for her to believe it was all over. She remembered every moment of anguish, every tear shed by her son's bedside, and now here she was, with Julian safe, and Isabella and Caleb facing the consequences of their actions. Clara arrived shortly after, smiling with that mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction that was so characteristic of her. She had decided to continue as Julian's nurse during his recovery, and over time, she had become a close friend to Mabel. They had shared a journey of struggle and sacrifice, and the bond they had forged was something that could not be easily broken. "I saw him a little better today," Clara said as she sat next to Mabel. "He's regaining mobility in his legs, and the doctors think he'll soon be able to start walking again, although it will be a slow process." Mabel smiled. Any small improvement was an immense gift for her. "Thank you, Clara. I don't know how I would have done all this without you," she said, her voice full of gratitude. Clara returned the smile, but her eyes reflected something deeper. "It wasn't just for Julian that I did it. You have been incredible, Mabel. Your love and determination saved your son. It was you who never gave up, not even when it seemed like all was lost." Mabel looked towards the horizon, letting Clara's words carry her away. She didn't consider herself a hero, far from it, but she knew she had fought with everything she had. In the end, it was a mother's love that had driven her, that had given her the strength to face Isabella despite all the difficulties. Later, Mabel went into the house and went straight to Julian's room. He was sitting in bed, with pillows supporting his back and his eyes closed, but upon feeling his mother's presence, he slowly opened his eyes and smiled. "Mom," he murmured in a soft but clear voice. Mabel approached and sat next to him, taking his hand in hers. The warmth of the contact comforted her, like a constant reminder that her son was still with her. "You're getting better every day, my son," she said tenderly. "Soon you'll be running through the fields again, like when you were a boy." Julian let out a small laugh, although the effort it took was noticeable. "Maybe I won't run as fast as before, but I hope to be on my feet soon." They were both silent for a moment, enjoying each other's company. The time for words was no longer as necessary as before. Just being together after all they had been through was enough. "I want you to know something, Mom," Julian said suddenly, his voice firmer. "All this time, even though I couldn't speak or move, I felt you. I knew you were close. Even when I was in the mansion, I knew you hadn't abandoned me. That was what gave me the strength to keep fighting, even when it seemed like all was lost." Mabel felt tears fill her eyes. She squeezed her son's hand tighter, trying to contain the emotions that overwhelmed her. "I will always be with you, Julian," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Always." With the passing of days, life began to find a new balance. Julian gradually regained more mobility, thanks to physical therapy sessions and the constant support of Clara and the doctors. The process was not easy, but each small step represented a victory, not only for him but also for Mabel, who saw her son becoming the strong and determined man she had always known again. On the other hand, Isabella and Caleb were sentenced to prison for their crimes. The trial had been a catharsis for Mabel, who, although full of pain for what her son had suffered, could see how justice finally prevailed. The empire that Isabella had tried to build on lies and betrayal collapsed, and although the damage done to Julian could not be completely erased, at least now she knew he was out of danger. Over time, Mabel decided to go back to living in her house in the country, the place that had always been her refuge, while Julian remained nearby in the small country house where he continued his recovery. The bond between mother and son had strengthened throughout everything they had been through, and both knew that although the road had been difficult, the most important thing was that they had traveled it together. Months later, on a quiet afternoon, Mabel and Julian decided to walk through the nearby fields. Julian, although he still needed support to walk long distances, felt stronger every day. The clear blue sky stretched above them as they walked slowly, remembering the times when Julian was just a boy running free through those same fields. "This place gives me peace," Julian said as he looked at the landscape. "It's as if everything we've been through is left behind every time I'm here." Mabel smiled, feeling the same relief. "This is where you will always find your home, son. No matter how far you go, this will always be your refuge." Julian looked at her and smiled. He knew that whatever happened in the future, he would always have his mother by his side. That was the true wealth, something that neither Isabella nor Caleb could ever take from him. The sun began to set on the horizon, and mother and son continued walking together, with the promise of a future full of peace after having faced and overcome the darkness. Life had changed, but the love and strength they shared would unite them forever. The road ahead may not be paved with roses, but they knew that as long as they held each other's hands, they would have the strength to rebuild everything. Each step was no longer weighed down by the burden of the past, but was lighter and steadier, heading towards a future where love is the one and eternal guiding light. The story concludes, but its echo lingers. It is a story about the love of a family, especially the bond between a mother and son, which is an extraordinary source of strength, capable of healing all wounds and helping us overcome the darkest adversities. No matter how difficult life gets, as long as you hold fast to your faith in the future and have someone to share the journey with, light and peace will return. If this story has touched your heart, don't forget to press like to spread its meaningful message. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next emotional journeys. And please leave a comment to share your thoughts.